Jim, you have been here for an energy conference in 1999 for the first time in St.Gallen. Now you're here at the St.Gallen Forum for Management of Renewable Energies, 17 years later. In terms of energy systems, lots of things have changed. So what, in your eyes, is the most important change since then?
Well, if I think of my home country, the UK, I think the biggest change is that we now have this Climate Change Act and mandatory climate change targets. And now we're no longer one of the real laggards in Europe when it comes to renewable energy generation, certainly renewable electricity. So back then we were 3% of electricity, now we're at 25%, so that's a huge change.
When we compare the UK, where you come from, and Switzerland, where we are today, there are some differences in this regard. For example, Switzerland didn't have this dynamic development in renewable electricity. And I have the feeling that policy changes are more frequent or dynamic in the UK. So who were the winners and losers of recent policy changes in the UK?
Yeah, there have been a lot of policy changes. Even though there's a cross-party, political party consensus on climate change action, the new government, which has been here for a year, has changed quite a lot of things. So the winners include offshore wind still, so some of the renewables are still in favour, a return to nuclear power, an emphasis on gas. The losers have been onshore wind, onshore large-scale solar. We've had a lot of solar farms with opposition. And energy efficiency programs have really suffered. So some of the changes have not been in line really with the long-term goal of cutting carbon at the lowest possible cost.
And on the other hand, at the end of last year, the government decided to phase out coal, which is quite positive in terms of climate change mitigation. Do you think the British case could be a role model for other countries in this regard?
I think it's very important symbolic declaration the government made. I mean, coal was phasing out anyway, and it's been phasing out ever since about 1970, so this is a long-term change in the UK. But by the middle of the next decade, we will have got rid of coal altogether, probably. The coal plants are getting very old. It's a model for other countries, but each country's got to find its own way out of coal, and I think it's easier for some, like the UK, than others, like, say, China, for example.
In your presentation today, you talked about community energy initiatives. These are quite popular in some European countries, such as Germany, Austria, and Denmark, for example, solar cooperatives. What's the status of these community energy initiatives in Great Britain, and what are the political drivers and barriers also for community energy?
Well, community energy has become very popular in the last 10 years in the UK, so there's a lot of projects, hundreds of projects. They don't actually generate a very large percentage of our energy or electricity, but they're very important. They've engaged people all over the UK. Some of the drivers have been a feed-in tariff, of course, like we have in many countries. That's really helped with things like solar. Supportive government at some positions, tax breaks, that kind of thing. But at the same time, the government has been a bit equivocal on that recently, and hasn't really reformed the market in a way which helps community energy. So it's in a bit of an uncertain time, rather like the renewables industry generally in the UK at the moment.
At the end of your talk, you pointed to some research directions that social science research on energy issues might be heading to. So, for example, you pointed to political economy and politics interests. They might be important in energy decision making. What kind of concrete research questions or what research agenda would you recommend in this regard?
Well, this is important, I think, because if you do modelling of energy futures, how do we reduce carbon at the lowest cost? It gives you a nice smooth curve of reductions in carbon, growth of clean technology, reduction in demand. What that modelling doesn't tell you is who's building what, and what is the role of some of the older incumbent companies in perhaps slowing down the transition. How might they change their business models to catch up with the new? What's the role of new entrants? So the big questions for me are about the politics of it. How does government manage that change? But also questions for businesses. Can businesses transform, or how do you manage the decline of some historic companies who are, for example, embedded in the fossil fuel industry, and how do you nurture the new companies? So there's some really tricky issues of transition there that I think we need to explore much more thoroughly.